I think it's important because, in the New Testament, Jesus refers to Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah, talking about the judgment and how Lot, was there and was mixed up with the folk. Peter, ends up writing about Lot, and it's kind of interesting because he's the one that actually calls him. And you guys understand, God is the one that's inspiring the writer. So God's saying that yes, Lot was a righteous man, and you're going, really? How do you call this a righteous man? But you'll understand this as we go through and we begin to see, because Abraham is who? He's the father of our faith. And what we're getting ready to see here is we're going to say, you're the father of our faith and you can't trust God to protect you? Yeah, and so it's kind of like, how does the word work? And you'll begin to see how things that God has and ordains is totally different than how we react. And that's really true for all of us in our lives. I mean, God saves us, but that doesn't mean we're all of a sudden pure and holy and don't do anything wrong.
So what's your definition of righteous that you call
Lot? Let me reverse the question real quick. Back in chapter 17, Abraham believed and God, reckoned him to be righteous.
Okay.
All right, so what does that mean?
That he believed in God.
He believed in God. What else, maybe?
Well, you have to be right living, right?
Well, is it so much? Okay, so that's the question. Is righteousness mean right living all the time?
Nobody can do that.
Huh?
Nobody can do that.
Yeah.
We're pressing forward towards God.
Yeah, it's pressing. In other words, he was imputed. Is and the way Paul puts it when he writes about God calling Abraham righteous, he says he was imputed righteousness.
So it's an Old Testament version of being a Christian.
It's an old, and again, I want to get away from the word Christian, because sometimes I think we call too many people Christians and not really call them what you may call a Christian. It's a person who is right with God, okay? So what is it, how do we, as believers in Christ, Christians, as believers in Christ, how do we become right with God? Believing in Him, believing in His Son Jesus Christ,
And living in His Word.
Believing in His Word. We put our faith, and we're going to talk a little bit more about faith, but we put our faith in who God is and God's promises. So when it says Abraham believed and God considered him or reckoned him to be righteous, it means that Abraham believed. And you go back to what this is about. He first tells them that you're going to be the father of many nations. He didn't say who through Sarah yet. He says you're going to be a father, and not only that, but you're going to inherit all this land. And Abraham's going, well, I don't have a son yet, so can this servant child be my son? Can he be the one? No. You're going to have a son through you. Then we find out later on it's a son through you and through Sarah. Because Sarah comes up and says, well, if you're going to be the father of many nations and I'm so old and I can't have a kid, hey, here's my handmaid. Go be a father. And that was their way. It wasn't nothing against Sarah, but she was in a sense respecting her husband and saying, if God's promising you this, and it can't be through me, I'm too old. So here's a young handmaiden. Take her. And Abraham does. He agrees with what Sarah does. But then we find out later on, that's not the one at all. God says, no, it's going to be through you and Sarah. And when Abraham hears this, he laughs. When Sarah hears about it, she laughs. And guess what? Isaac's name is Laughter. So, but anyway, getting back. So what happens here is in Paul, so you can turn to it, 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through 10. Now, you got to understand Peter, and I really hate sometimes just pulling scripture out of another book, and not really giving you the full story. So, all the letters that are written in the New Testament, we've talked about this before, are not written for the world. I mean, the world can read them, but they're really written to talk to the believers. that were accepting Jesus Christ. Most of the letters that are in the New Testament are written by Paul. Then we have John, who was a disciple. We have James and Jude, who are half-brothers of Jesus. And then we also have Peter, who is, the rock. And Peter, his first letter, ends up, describing who Christ is and says, you are to be holy as he is holy. And then he goes on with the rest of that letter, explaining what does it really mean to be holy as he is holy. Now in chapter 2, what's happening, and you'll see this also in Jude and with other letters, even like in Galatians, people are beginning to come in with all these false teachings. So it's, we're talking now, it's been 40 plus years since Christ has risen. And all these false teachers are starting to come in. No different than the day, folks.
Yeah.
Nothing new underneath the sun. We're constantly, we can sit here and we can name off all these little false prophets that we've had in our lifespan, and you can look at history and you can see all throughout history there's always been this false teaching. Why? Because Satan's trying to distort and destroy what God is doing. And so what happens here is Peter's writing to the church, and he's saying, hey, look, there's going to be false teachings going on. And so here's the judgment that's going to happen with these guys. So starting with verse 4 in chapter 2. For God did not even spare the angels who sinned. He threw them all into hell, into the gloomy pits of the darkness, where they were to be held until the day of judgment. And God did not spare the ancient world, except for Noah and 7 others in his family. Noah warned the world of God's righteous judgment. So God protected Noah. And when he destroyed the world of ungodly people in a vast flood, later God condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and turned them into heaps of ashes. He made them an example of what will happen to ungodly people. But God also rescued Lot out of Sodom because he was a righteous man who was sick of the sinful, immoral, and wicked people around him. Yes, Lot was a righteous man who was tormented in his soul by the wickedness that he saw and heard day after day. So you see, the Lord knows how to rescue godly people from the trials, even while keeping the wicked under punishment until the day of final judgment. He is especially hard on those who follow their twisted sexual desires and who despise authority. So you sit there and you read this and you go, okay, wait a minute. How do you really call Lot righteous? God, wait a minute, you're telling Paul and you're inspiring Paul to write this. How is it you're really seeing? And so we got to go back. What did Lot do? Okay, first we find Lot. Where was he at? He was sitting at the city gate. Place of prominence. Now, not to say that Lot's example in that city was exemplar. But as soon as he sees these 2 guys come in, he doesn't know they're angels right away. But he sees something special about it, and he sees these 2 guys come in. What does he do?
Invites them in.
Yeah, he invites them in. They say, no, we're going to just sleep in the square. We don't need that. And he insists. Says, yes, you need to come and stay with me.
Could it be considered a distraction? Like he was trying to hustle him into the house, trying to hustle his daughters off on him, trying to keep him from seeing the reality of the decadence that's going on.
I don't know if it's a distraction or if it was just a protection. In that he knew what the city was like. And that,
And what they would do to strangers.
And what they would do to these 2 men strangers. And what they were trying to still do. But I think what he was trying to do was he was trying to protect them. So in the righteousness of Lot knew God. And and that's why I like, you go back to John chapter 10. It says there's nothing that can snatch you out of God's hands. I really do believe that if you put your faith in Old Testament days or New Testament days, you put your faith in God and trust in God, God's going to hold on to you. There's no doubt about that. It says in Romans chapter 8, and neither height nor depth nor principalities nor anything, we're more than conquerors. There's nothing that can separate us from the love of God. Nothing. That includes any stupid thing that I end up doing, which we're going to see here with Abraham. any stupid thing, God still says, hey, there's not going to. Why? Because there's a difference between our relationship with God and God's relationship with us. And we need to be able to understand that we're sinful people, and the only reason we have a relationship with God right now is because of Jesus Christ. In the Old Testament days, and Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, in the Old Testament days, they looked forward to the Messiah. They still had their faith in God. It's not like, because I've had people say, well, okay, all the Christians are getting to heaven because of Jesus Christ. What about all the people that lived in the Old Testament days? Does that mean everybody in the Old Testament days is going to hell? No. Who stood there with Jesus on the Mount in Transfiguration? Elijah and Moses. They didn't come from hell. They had faith in God. And that's why, going back to what you were saying, what is righteous? Is that faith that God declares us to be righteous because we have that faith in Him. And I believe the same thing that God says that, hey, there's nothing that's going to snatch us out of His hands. If God, and again, you have to, it's taking ourselves out of our picture, trying to imagine God and trying to see God through His eyes. God knows every one of us before the world was born. God knows every one of us before we even made the decision to accept Christ into our hearts and trust Him. God knew that. And so it's, Paul calls it predestination. And then some theologians go into deeper roots of this predestination. In other words, where God went eeny, meeny, miny, mo. God didn't go eeny, meeny, miny, mo. But what He did is, in His knowledge, in His foreknowledge, He knew that Phil was going to sit here and that all of us were going to be here studying His Word, trusting Him. He knew that before the world began. So if He knew, and then that's where we have to sometimes, and it's mind-boggling as it is, we have to come to the grips that God has a lot more infinite knowledge than we ever imagined. And so why it says nothing's going to snatch you out of God's hands, because He already knows you're in His hands. He already knows who you are. Just like how David writes in Psalm 139, you knew me before I was even formed. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. We have to recognize all that is part of God creating us, who we are. Allowing us to go through the things that you're going to see here with Abraham. Allowing us to go through the stupid mistakes that we'll make. But still not separating ourselves from God. Because our faith is in a promise of God, not built on our works. And that's where a lot of the other religions of the world, they're more about what you do that gets you into heaven instead of what God has done for us. And that's a big difference. I know there's certain, and I'm not going to call out denominations, but there's certain Christian faiths where it's all about, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing?
That's how it works.
And yes, James will tell you in his letter, you show me faith and I'll show you my works. You show me your works and I'll show you faith. But my works are not getting me to heaven. My works are my acts of love and respect to a God that's already done it for me. And so I put my faith in a God, and because of my faith in God, yes, I see giving tithes as being an act of worship. I see that everything I own being an act of worship, giving it back to God. When I go to my job, I see it as an act of worship because it's a mission field. When I live in my neighborhood, I see it as an act of God because it's a mission field. And I begin to see things differently and begin to view my life totally differently because of what God's already done for me. And when we have that right relationship with God, then we begin to see things differently than the way the world wants us to see it. So with Lot, you sit there and you say, okay, well, he was a righteous man. He knew who God was. He was with Abraham. The thing that separated between him and Abraham, Abraham was a very mature young man. You go one way, I go the other. He didn't even know what direction Lot was going to take. Lot could have said, hey, look, I'm going to stay right here in Canaan. And Abraham would have gone somewhere else. But Lot saw with his eyes, and we talked about this, he saw with his eyes that, hey, that land over towards Jordan on the other side of the Dead Sea looks very fertile. I'm going to go there. And then when he gets there, And just as Peter writes, his witness wasn't strong enough to even protect his family. And I think that's where I would have a hard time. I mean, I'd rather go, really, God? You're calling him righteous? Look what his 2 daughters did. But again, that righteousness is not just me. That righteousness is my faith in a God who loves me. And just as you said, Don, what did Abraham do? He prayed. But still, I honestly believe that if Abraham never even petitioned God to save the righteous in Sodom and Gomorrah, and with the numbers that he went down from 50 all the way to 10, God still would have protected Lot. It's just that petition that Abraham had was his care. But Lot wasn't saved because Abraham petitioned God to save him. God saved Lot because of his relationship with him, even though, and here's Jordan shared this several months ago when he talked about the seeds. And if you remember, one seed would fall on really rocky soil, hard soil, couldn't penetrate the ground. It was gone. One seed fell in the cliffs of the rocks where there's just a little bit of dirt, but then there was no roots, and it was gone. Both of those probably, as Jordan said, and I agree with this, is that probably those 2 seeds, or those 2 people that received that seed, probably never accepted Christ. But then there was a seed before the 4th seed. Then there was a seed who grew up in good land, but the weeds crowded it out. And I believe that's what you see in Lot's life, is that Lot knew who God was, but the weeds of the city were just crowding it out, where his witness wasn't even strong enough for his 2 son-in-laws to believe in, because they just said, "Oh, you're just joking." And then when it all happens, look what his daughters do. So his witness, even in his own family, because his wife turned around and went to a pillar of salt. His 2 daughters said, "Hey, look, we're never going to get a man now." And look what they did to their dad. They got him drunk so they could have sex with him and have a child. And you think, good gravy. But still, his righteousness, and God loved Lot. Because of his righteousness, God rescued Lot. Nothing can snatch us out of God's hands. When God has a hold of us, nothing's going to take us away from God. We may grow up like that seed in the weeds. We can destroy our witness. We can be laughed at. The guys of the city would sit there and say, "Hey, look, if you don't open that door, we're going to do worse to you than what we were going to do to these 2 men behind the door." And the angels grabbed them and pulled them in and blinded them. So we have to see that hey, this is all showing why God's, as Peter writes, in his love and his righteous judgment. How he condemned Sodom and Gomorrah, even as an example, is what Peter writes to the rest of the ungodly, to say, hey, look, you continue this path, this is what's going to happen. You're going to face God's righteous judgment. So I wanted to hit that before we dive in, because like I said before, I honestly believe that the next story we're going to read here, within a year period of time, before Sarah has a child, Abraham moves south. Now, if you remember, let's go back to when Abraham, he comes into Canaan, he's building an altar. He gets down and he heads towards the south part and closer to Egypt. What does he do?
He didn't build an altar.
He didn't build an altar. And all of a sudden, the famine came and everything else, and he goes, I got to do something here. I got to go to Egypt. He goes to Egypt, and his first thoughts was, hey, look, and he tells his wife, hey, you are my sister. You're also my wife. I want you to tell everybody you're my sister, because they may kill me. And you're going to see the same thing. So let's go into it. Genesis chapter 20. Now Abram journeyed from there towards the land of Negvid and settled in Kadesh and Shur. Then he sojourned into Gerar. No, nothing, and as I said before, nothing has ever come out good in this area up to this point in time. You're going to see how it changes. But it seems like every time he heads close to Egypt, it's just like he slides in his faith. Because remember, God said, I need you to walk before me. I'm the God Almighty. I am, where's that? El Shaddai. I am the God Almighty. He says, I want you to walk before me blameless. But anyway, here's Abraham. So he says to his wife Sarah, she is my sister. So Abimelech, you're going to see this name several times in Genesis. It's not the name of a person, okay? It's most likely a title, because you're going to see this, unfortunately, you're going to see that the same sin that Abraham does twice, his son's going to do again also. But Abimelech is more like a title. It means that my father is king. So Abimelech, the king of Gera, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream of a night and said to him, behold, you are a dead man because of the woman who you have taken, for she is married. Now Abimelech had not even come near to her, and he said, Lord, will you slay a nation even though blameless? Did he not himself say to me, she is my sister? And she herself said, he is my brother. The integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands, I have done this. Then God said to him in a dream, yes, I know the integrity of your heart, and you have done this. And I also kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Now, therefore, restore the man's wife, for he is a prophet. Okay? Now, what's a prophet?
A mouthpiece of God.
A mouthpiece of God. He is the person that stands before the people and being the mouthpiece of what God's saying. Okay? It's different because Melchizedek was what? He was a priest and a king, but he wasn't a prophet. Okay? This is the first time we actually see the word in Genesis, and I like this because Genesis is all new beginnings. But here God's calling Abraham a prophet. He is the mouthpiece of God. It's good. He is the mouthpiece of God. And he will pray for you. Again, this is everything else because you don't see mentioning prayer. I mean, we've seen Abraham have talks with God up to this point in time, but no one ever actually called it in Scripture prayer. But now what God is telling Abimelech, he's going to pray for you. He's going to intercede for you to me, and that you will live. But if you do not restore to her, know that you will surely die, you and all who are with you. So he's saying, hey, look, you're as good as a dead man if you don't listen to what I want to say. Abimelech's saying, I didn't do nothing wrong. So Abimelech arose early in the morning, called all of his servants, told them these things in their hearings, and the men were greatly frightened. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, what is it you've done to us? And how have I sinned against you that you have brought on me and on my kingdom such a great sin? See, even in I was reading this in the commentaries, they were saying, even in the Canaan religions, stuff like that, having adultery was wrong. Okay? So here was, for the king to take a married woman and put her inside his harem is still considered adultery. And even in other religions, even pagan religions, that was still considered wrong. So it was...
She was like 90.
Yeah. Well, she's 90, but I mean,
Right.
Still.
Right.
I'm thinking Sarah was a beautiful woman. Really beautiful. My wife's beautiful. But Sarah was a beautiful woman even at the age of 90. So, Abimelech calls him and says, what have you done to us? How that I have sinned against you, and you have brought on me and on my kingdom such a great sin. You have done to me these things that ought not be done. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what have you encountered that you have done these things to us? This is interesting. Who's rebuking who?
Abimelech.
Yeah. He's most likely not worshiping the true God, although the true God spoke to him. But you got to understand, even during this period of time, the Canaanites were worshiping many gods. So God speaking to him at night probably didn't take him by surprise, but still in the same sense, he's recognizing that there was a God that talked to him and told him you're as good as dead if you touch this woman. Okay? God's saying this because, hey, this is going to mess up the whole plan that God had with Sarah being with a child from Abraham. We're talking within a year's period of time. I'm not even sure how close it was from the time Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed to this period of time. It's a good probability that even this king in the south has heard at least somewhat of what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. So he, in a sense, he's probably himself very concerned. What is this you've done to not only me, but to my whole kingdom? So Abraham said, because I thought, get this now, because I thought, surely there is no fear of God in this place, they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she actually is my sister, the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother. She became my wife. And it came about that when God caused me to wander from my father's house, that he said to her, this is the kindness which you can show me. Everywhere we go, you say that he is my brother. So this was a plan that Abraham, as we see, has already had in his mind. He already did this once in Egypt. And he's still trying in his mind, even though God continually gives him all these promises, he still has in his mind that, hey, I still got to protect myself. I still got to take care of myself. And hey, the best way to take care of myself is, hey, I know that, if they take you, they'll kill me because they don't want to do adultery. They can kill me. And then they can take a wife. So you say that I'm your brother, and they won't kill me, they'll just take you. That's a plan in his mind. And again, just like I've told us before, don't ever point one finger at Abraham and have three fingers pointing back at you, because you have to stop and think, how do we make some sort of these same plans in our mind with God? Well, God, I know you can do this, and I know you can do this, but, God, I need to really do it this way to protect my wealth, or, hey, protect my house, or protect my family, or protect my kids. We come up with these little schemes.
Just in case.
Just in case. And does it really diminish our faith? Yes, some. But totally not in God's eyes. Because God knew who Abraham was. God knew who Abraham is. God knew who Abraham's going to be. And the thing is that in God's eyes, he's stopping this from... Abraham makes this royal mistake. God's having to get in and intervene. Abraham wasn't going to intervene. This is all part of his plan to stay alive. Yes, I can have faith in God, but sometimes I feel like I've got to do this, God, to kind of help you along, God.
Just in case.
Just in case.
God
doesn't need our plans. If he already has. I love how Jeremiah says, I already have plans for you. No. We still, even though we hear that and we know that verse, we still go, I think I still got to do this, God. I got to accept this job here, or I got to go do this, or I got to go do this. And sometimes we really don't even take it to where we sit down and we really pray through the decision, asking God for leadership. We kind of just take off on our own, and we say, well, here's what I'm going to do. This is what Abraham does. So he gets there. And so Abimelech took some sheep, I love this, took some sheep and oxen, some male and female servants, and he gave them to Abraham, and he restored Abraham's wife to him. Abimelech said, behold, my land is before you, settle wherever you please. Now, you got to understand, when Abraham moved down to this region, it wasn't just like you and me moving to a house. Abimelech, no doubt, has seen the size of Abraham's wealth. So in a sense, taking Sarah, his sister, into his harem was almost like, hey, I'm trying to build this little partnership with you. It's like that, hey, I want to be friends with you. And you got your sister, and I'm going to take care of her. He wasn't going to, he wasn't going to abuse her, but he was going to make her part of his harem. And in a sense, it was kind of like in Abimelech's mind, it was kind of like building a partnership with him, because he sees the vastness and he sees the entourage that Abraham has as he moves. So it's not like just you and I moving from one house to another house. Abraham takes all of his cattle, all of his camels, all of his oxen, his lambs, sheep, everything, all the people. that are in his house, and they move down here. That's got to be its own little caravan in itself. And so the king sees all this. And so now he hears from God that not only is Abraham just this wealthy man, but he's also a prophet of God. To a pagan king who worships many gods, but here's this prophet of God. And so what Abimelech does, he says, hey, look, I'm going to give you this. Very much similar to the way Pharaoh did the same thing. But Pharaoh gave him the same thing and escorted him out of the land. Here, not only that, here, I'm going to pay you. Here's your wife back. I'm going to pay you, but let me show you the door. You know, but Abimelech says, hey, look, you can stay. Because I recognize that and God has told me who you are. I want to be in your good company. And so he does this, and you can settle wherever you please. To Sarah he says, behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Behold, this is your vindication before all who are with you, and before all men you are cleared. In other words, I want everybody to know that I didn't do anything wrong, and I'm, in fact, giving money back to your brother, to your husband, and you're clear from any wrongdoings at all. Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his maids, so they could bore children. For the Lord had closed fast all the wombs of the household of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. So, God was, here's the things that God was doing. Not only was he going to become a dead man, but he was already saying, hey, I'm closing all the wombs. Nothing's going to happen. You have got to do something here. Because, again, this is going to mess up God's plans. God's not going to allow that. It's kind of interesting, and I want you to kind of keep this in mind in the back of your mind. Satan, from the day of Adam and Eve, all the way through, has been trying to destroy the seed. This genealogy has been trying to destroy that seed that God promised to Adam and Eve. It's been Satan's goal to destroy it. And it's really when you pay attention to that and you begin to see the different things, the different people throughout the Old Testament and how they screwed up or how they got themselves in a big mess. Or all the kings. And if you read through the Chronicles and 1st and 2nd Kings, all the kings, even the kings of Judah who became wicked, even to the point where Babylon ends up taking over finally Judah, because Samaria, where the northern kingdom was, Israel, was already taken over by the Persians. Now the Persians are coming to take over Judah in that land, and the last king was taken into custody and put into the prison there in Persia. But years later, once the Medes came by, and they overthrew the Babylonian kingdom, they brought that king out, and they didn't restore him back into his kingship. They allowed him to sit at the king's table, of the Medes' table. Satan tried to snuff out that seed all the way through and could not do it. Because this is part of God's plan. That seed that he promised to Abraham to Adam and Eve, Satan's been trying to destroy ever since. So we begin to see here that, hey, even this little lie is just an attempt to destroy what God has already planned. And it's not man trying to destroy it. It's, again, we have to stop and think, who's really controlling a lot of things around our world? We can look at the politics and everything else, but when you really begin to look at it, where did Paul write in Ephesians chapter 6? We don't fight against flesh and blood. We fight against principalities and things. The supernatural. And the weapons are not the weapons that we have that we think about and everything else. The weapons is the sword. It's God's word. That's the only weapon that he gives us. The rest of it's all armor. And he tells us to stand. Not run into battle, because God's already got the battle. He just wants us to stand firm in that armor with that sword in hand. So before we go into chapter 21.